Nadine was 15 years old. Her parents were not at home that night. She went to bed as usual, but she was suddenly awakened by two men standing right beside her bed. They ordered her to get dressed. "If you try to run, we will put handcuffs on you." They dragged her out of the house, drove her to the airport, and put her on a private jet. "Do you want to know where we are flying?" After the plane landed, they put her in a car and drove her deep into the desert. There they handed her an envelope. Inside was a letter. "Dear Nadine, this is for the best. We love you, Mom and Dad." The beginning of the story sounds like the plot of some TikTok thriller. There is even video footage showing a huge number of police officers gathered around a shopping center in Miami. Some eyewitnesses claimed they saw abnormally gigantic figures that looked like aliens. Gunshots were heard, and at the exact same moment when the massive police presence arrived, the city's airports were closed and the power was completely cut off in that entire area. But what really happened there? I know it's winter right now, but how about a summer camp? I suppose many of you have been to summer camps. Swimming in the sea or hiking through the forest, feeling like super-grown UPS for the first time, far away from your parents. Sure, at night you probably cried into your pillow because you missed them so much, but during the day you felt free and incredibly adult. Today's story, however, is not about a typical summer camp. In this camp, children were sent as punishment. And what if you might never come back from it? Challenger Foundation. Yes, as I said, this camp was not ordinary at all. It was a so-called wilderness survival camp. Utah. Desert. What exactly went on in this desert camp? Children, together with their counselors, were forced to hike through the scorching Utah desert. And do you know how long this hike lasted? 62 days. During that time, they covered 800 kilometers in 40-degree heat. Moreover, the children had no proper sleeping places. They had almost no water reserves. And that is exactly the camp where Nadine, who had been kidnapped, ended up. Every single person who entered this camp arrived in the same way. Parents ordered the abduction of their own children in the middle of the night. Two unknown men would kidnap you, drag you into a car, fly you on a plane, transfer you to another vehicle, drive you for hours into the desert, and then simply leave you there. Great idea, thanks, Mom and Dad. On top of that, a ticket to this camp cost up to tens of thousands of dollars. Many parents gave literally their last savings to send their child to such a place. But maybe it was worth it? The parents were initially thrilled with the idea because they simply did not know what to do with their out-of-control teenagers. And the man who came up with all of this was Steve Cartizano. Yes, it really looked like some kind of brutal military boot camp. Already on the first evening, the children were yelled at. The most interesting part is that before sending their child, the parents had to sign documents stating that they waived any claims against the program. Very convenient, isn't it? From the very first videos, you can see that they were breaking the children's psyches in this camp. And according to the staff, it was not to offend or punish them, though it is hard to imagine any child later thanking their parents for what happened next. If teenagers disobeyed, they were beaten, tied to trees, and dragged across the ground. The teenagers seriously slept on the bare earth. They were not given tents or mattresses. Instead of a bed, they had some dirty blanket. Can you feel how this story is already becoming darker? I mentioned that they had no tents or normal sleeping places. What about the toilet and shower? There was none of that either. I know it is almost impossible to believe. Seriously, parents paid such enormous amounts of money just so their children could be genuinely tortured. Steve Cartizano constantly called the children manipulators and liars and urged his own staff, the counselors, to believe it too. One teenager named Matthew once woke up in the morning and simply could not make himself walk any farther. Instead of showing sympathy or trying to understand the boy, the counselors decided to drag him by his ankles across the desert. They pulled him for a very long time. In the end, Matthew became extremely ill and had to be taken to the hospital. The doctor counted more than 80 scars and bruises on his back. The sheriff was called to the hospital because Matthew's condition was horrifying. The staff of the program had abused this child. And do you know what Steve Cartizano said when he learned about the terrible actions of his own employees? He said the teenager was to blame himself. In the end, Matthew's mother flew in and took him home. More than 800 children went through this program, and Cartizano earned millions of dollars from it. Interestingly, Steve's wife did not think he was doing anything wrong, probably because Steve had bought a big new house in Utah and a Lamborghini. Maybe that is why his wife did not consider him guilty of anything. She genuinely believed in what her husband was doing. On June 27, 1990, the phone rang. "Hello, this is Steve Cartizano. Right now we are taking a girl from your camp to the hospital. You need to come immediately." Steve Cartizano received a call from the police and immediately flew to the desert by helicopter with his assistant. They tried to resuscitate the girl, but within seconds the doctor pronounced her dead. The girl who died in the camp was named Kryn. She was 16 years old. She had spent only 3 days in the camp out of the planned 62. They had walked 8 kilometers through the desert when she collapsed and never regained consciousness. Why did it happen? She was not physically prepared. The desert heat was almost 40 degrees, and they had almost no water because the distance between water points was about 15 kilometers. This shows that not every person can physically endure such conditions. But it seemed Steve Cartizano really did not care. Of course, some parents did not wish their children any harm, but there were others whose attitude was simply horrifying. The most interesting thing is that the Challenger Foundation was not some underground organization that parents secretly paid. These camps were so popular that even children of super rich and famous parents were sent there. One of them was Paris Hilton. Once she could not stand the pressure and tension anymore and decided to run away with her friend. But the camp staff quickly realized that 2 girls had escaped and chased after them. They caught them very fast. When they were brought back to the camp, the counselors beat Paris Hilton and her friend right in front of the other children. I never stopped being shocked by the parents who paid for this. So what happened to the camp after the girl's death? A huge number of complaints and accusations poured in from parents and officials. The police came to Steve Cartizano's office with a search warrant, and the camp was shut down. 800 children had gone through it, and guess what? No one from those 800 was ever sent to his camp again. Although we will talk about that a little later. At the height of all the accusations and the court case, Steve Cartizano decided to appear on a TV program. As the host noted, he looked completely calm. And then came the day of the verdict for Steve Cartizano. Everyone was waiting for the moment when the creator of such a cruel camp would finally be found guilty. There was only one question. How severe would the punishment be? The jury came out to announce the verdict. Not guilty. Not guilty. Literally everything pointed to the fact that Steve Cartizano was guilty, but for some incomprehensible reason the jury decided he should be acquitted. By the way, a jury consists of ordinary people chosen at random. I have my own theory about why they acquitted him, but it seems they could have been bribed. Besides, Steve Cartizano had a lot of money. His wife, when asked about all the court cases, said the following: "I am in shock at how this woman worries about her own children and how little she cares about those who were tortured in her husband's camp." As I said, even before the trials, the camps run by Steve were closed by the authorities. But Steve did not know how to make money any other way, so he opened a new camp, America's Healing. The desert hiking was left in the past. Now Steve's camp transformed into luxury cruises around the Caribbean islands for rich, uncontrollable children. Periodically, they were dropped off on deserted islands where they wandered through the jungle trying to find food. And guess what? People believed in the program again. They fell for it again and once more trusted that their children could be fixed in this camp. By the way, Steve wrote all the advertising himself. He knew exactly which painful points to press so that parents would bring him their money. Steve even sent his own son David to one of his camps because the boy had become involved with drugs. Spoiler, it did not help him. This new camp did not last very long because at some point people working at a research station on the island where the children and Steve Cartizano's staff were staying noticed that the teenagers looked extremely bad, dirty, and disheveled. So those people decided to call the police. The police contacted Steve, and he realized the situation was very serious and that he could be arrested. Instead of surrendering, do you know what he did? He took all the children hostage and set off on an endless cruise. The teenagers became prisoners on a floating camp. For several months, they simply sailed across the open ocean, moving from island to island and trying to avoid any contact with the police. The moral state of the teenagers was simply terrible. Just imagine. For 9 months they were floating around and had no idea what was happening. At one point they reached another island, Puerto Rico. The children constantly tried to escape. They understood that this camp was never going to end. But of course Steve Cartizano did not like that. They kept trying to run away. Do you know what he did? He decided to tie them up and leave them in a car. Moreover, he put a noose around each of their necks and attached the ropes to the car so they could not go anywhere. In the end, the police noticed the children tied to the car. And no, this is not some cheap thriller. The police immediately understood that something was wrong simply because of the level of cruelty. They thought some mafia was operating, but it was just Steve Cartizano with his camp. In the end, the children were freed and sent back to their parents. Steve's camp had no license to work with children. He had kidnapped them for 9 whole months. They were found only by pure luck, or because of Steve Cartizano's own stupidity. Steve Cartizano was a real con man. And do you know why Steve Cartizano never received any punishment? Remember I told you that before sending their children to the camp, the parents signed agreements in which they waived all claims? That is exactly why. In other words, they had officially refused to make any claims about their children being missing for so long or being held hostage. So Steve Cartizano simply opened a new camp, Pacific Academy, in the year 2000. Every day a good child makes a wrong decision. That was the new brochure for Steve's camp. But because Steve Cartizano now had a rather bad reputation, he simply changed his name. Now he called himself Mal. He just changed his name and opened a new camp. By the way, the prices had already gone up, and admission for a child cost from $25,000 to $30,000, depending on how difficult the child's character was. $25,000. What was the idea behind the new camp run by Steve Cartizano? The children were brought to the island of Samoa and released onto a clearing in the jungle. And yes, you heard correctly, this was simply a clearing in the middle of the jungle. There was absolutely nothing on that clearing. The teenagers were forced to build their own shelter by themselves. In my opinion, this camp was one of the cruelest. There were only boys in it, and as an exception they brought one girl for correction. The camp leader did something terrible to her. In the end, she told a counselor everything that had happened, and he said to her, "Don't make a mountain out of a molehill." Seriously. By the way, the footage you saw was filmed by the parent of one of the teenagers who was in this camp. Together with that recording, he decided to go straight to the US Embassy instead of the police. I have a video recording that you must see before the camp staff find out about it. Please help me get my son out of the country. The embassy immediately understood that things were very, very bad. There was clear evidence of a crime. The parent and his son went to the airport together with an embassy employee who had the cassette in his suitcase. The camp management had already learned about it. Moreover, they contacted the airport staff and told them not to let the father leave with the recording under any circumstances. But why would the airport staff in Samoa help some camp employees? What was in it for them? The way they presented the information was clever. They said that if this recording left Samoa, the entire tourism industry on the island would suffer. And believe it or not, the airport staff gave the father a real interrogation. They tried to find out where the cassette was. But the father defended the recording with all his strength. He said it was already too late. He had sent it on another flight to the United States. They let him go. In the end, he took the recording from the embassy employee and flew with it to the United States. Once again, a court case was opened against Steve Cartizano, and it began in April 2001. And then something happened that changed a lot. Oh my God. And after these events, almost no one cared about Steve Cartizano anymore. Yes, he endlessly created new, extremely cruel camps for teenagers, but after September 11th, the government's priorities had changed dramatically, and they really did not care about Cartizano and his court cases. Cartizano did not pose a threat to U.S. national security, so he received no punishment. Meanwhile, his daughter Kathy became involved with drugs and started stealing various equipment from the house. In other words, while Steve was busy correcting other people's children, he completely neglected his own. And remember his son David, whom he had sent to one of his own camps. Well, David ended up in prison and is still serving his sentence. His daughter Kathy, after using drugs, got into a terrible car accident. Kathy survived, and at that moment she decided to pull herself together and went to rehab. When she came out, she received some news. Many people consider this some kind of karma. You know what else amazes me? The people who worked with Steve still continue to justify him to this day and speak warmly about him. And pay attention to the words of Steve's lawyer, who helped him win his first case with the original desert camp. This is simply absurd. It is funny. All of Steve's actions are obvious, but for some reason everyone continues to justify him. Oh yes, there is one more thing, sorry. The continuation of this story is quite dark, which is why I decided to save the rest for Darkland. But what about now? Right now, wilderness therapy has enormous popularity, and on TikTok you can find a gigantic number of videos from grown-up teenagers sharing their terrible experiences. And these camps are not closing, they still exist to this day. Now let us think. Did Steve Cartizano really sincerely want the children to improve, or was something else driving him? To answer this question, I will repeat the cost of the ticket once more: $16,000. And for those $16,000 there was nothing except abuse and cruel treatment. No food, no toilet, no shower, no normal sleeping place. In other words, the costs of maintaining the children were minimal. So the question again, did Steve Cartizano really sincerely want the children to improve? Ariana Grande married Ethan Slater. And by the way, recently one political activist spoke out about Ariana Grande. Ariana Grande has been a real homewrecker throughout her entire career. She suffers from some kind of sexual disorder. More about that in House of Celebrities. And that was Jane Kravitz. Thank you for watching.